These two talks are about phenomena that are absolutely universal in all cultures and throughout history. And my research into them suggests very strongly that they are fundamental to human thinking and to human psychology. Magic, as I explained it last week, in the 6 principles that I outlined and discussed, are absolutely universal, found in all cultures and all levels of society, having no correlation with level of education or anything else. Tonight, we're going to talk about something slightly different, witchcraft. Like magic, witchcraft is another loaded term with a great many meanings. I hope you can read this text from the back. Can you? Can you make it out? These are some of the meanings of witchcraft that I have assembled over the years. You may have others. I outlined various meanings of magic. Depending on your own attitude toward other people's supernatural beliefs, you might label all of that as witchcraft, meaning it's evil, meaning perhaps that it is of Satan. Any of the meanings of sorcery, the word sorcery and witchcraft are often interchangeable, but in anthropology they are very different. And I have another screen about sorcery, which I'll come to in a minute, but that is often a synonym for witchcraft. We saw last week that, in fact, sorcery is magic in the anthropological sense. It uses the methods of magic for selfish or harmful ends. It is learned. It is not innate. It doesn't require any special skill, but it is always clandestine. It is always hidden because it's antisocial and dangerous. You've probably read the whole thing while I'm talking. One of the terrors of PowerPoint is a lecturer who puts up a screen of text, not realizing that the audience reads the whole thing within a minute and proceeds to read it. And I'm not going to take up your time reading it. I trust that you have. So going through the various meanings of the word, we get to the ethnological meaning. Ethnology is anthropology's cross-cultural comparative approach. Throughout history and in most cultures of the world, there is a belief in a being called in English a witch. This being is capable of doing a lot of things. And I have enumerated those things on a sheet. I hope you all have it. It's called Attributes of the Ethnological Witch. Do you all have it? And if you don't, please put up your hand and John will give you a copy. You should have got it when you checked in. John, there are several hands up. We'll come to that in a few minutes. So let me just look at sorcery, which is one of the most common synonyms for witchcraft. Sorcery, any of the meanings of magic, depending on, again, on your own religious or beliefs or lack of it. Any of the forbidden occult practices that are condemned in the Bible. Native healing, shamanism, mystical healing is often called witch doctoring. The term comes from a colonial era of ignorance in what was going on. The real legitimate use of the term witch doctor is to refer to a person who heals people who are victims of witchcraft. Or he can remove the witchcraft power from suspected witches who don't want to have the power. And various other meanings of sorcery. In my courses at UB, I also teach courses in the anthropology of religion. And I devised a typical model of a religious system. that operates over two dimensions. What I call the horizontal dimension, which is the standard practice of religion, the relationship between people and elevated divinities, sacred beings that are up there. And the horizontal dimension, which is ignored in contemporary mainstream religion, a belief in spirits and other agencies that are out there. They are on our level of existence. This includes, in many cultures, ghosts and ancestors and nature spirits. In this cosmos, this cosmological system, there are also forces, which I discussed last time. Recognition of beliefs in forces, these engines in nature that make things happen, is essential for understanding magic. And for the purposes of teaching this stuff, it's helpful to consider the beliefs in forces as if they are separate supernatural agencies. They're not beings, but they are agencies. They make things happen. Also, there is another category of supernatural character called the witch. Witchcraft is sometimes called spiritual. It's sometimes called mystical. It is in a category by itself. In world ethnology, the witch or witchcraft is a belief. I emphasize that. The witch is imaginary. I emphasize that. A belief in a power that exists in certain adults. Why some and not others, no one is quite sure. This power develops after adolescence. It usually does not exist in children, although in parts of the world today it is in children, and that's a whole other problem in this area of study. The power enables the person to do a whole list of fantastic and terrible things. The witchcraft power is within an individual, but it is separable from the individual. It can fly out of the body. It can take different forms. It can be in the form of its bearer and appear somewhere else. So in cultures that believe in witchcraft, the witch can be in two places at once. The power can take the bearer with it so that the body can fly through space and go somewhere else. Or it can change itself into any other form and fly off, leaving its bearer behind. These are attributes of this imaginary creature that I have identified over the years. And taken together, these 14 attributes constitute what I have realized is really a prototype conspiracy theory. Let's go through them quickly, and I'm going to have some more discussion, and then I'm going to show slides to illustrate these attributes, and I'll show you some interesting things about the witch. As I've already said, the witch is not quite universal, but the attributes are universal. People believe in all of and fear all of these attributes. Only in certain types of society are they all vested in one being, the witch. And those societies are thickly settled. They are agricultural or societies based on some immovable principle. And they are settled. People have formed towns and villages and cities, and mobility is restricted. They can't easily move away from each other. These kinds of societies, going way, way back to classical Greece, believe in the flying, transforming, child-stealing witch. Societies that move frequently, nomadic societies, do not have that belief. They have all of these individual fears and fantasies, but they are not vested in one being. This is one of the puzzles, issues of the belief in witchcraft that I have dealt with in my history of my study. The first attribute, I'm just reminded, I see Sarah here. I completely forgot my own acknowledgments. I wanted to thank Rick Zotaro, who first invited me, Sarah, for setting this whole thing up and duplicating this thing for you, and John for the introduction. I'm very sorry, you guys. I remiss. And my longtime friends, Joe and Diana Nickel in the middle. You know Joe Nickel. I'm sure you all know him, or you know his work. One of the pillars of the CFI for how many decades, Joe?
Oh, just about 50 years. My 50th anniversary.
Yeah, wow. Anyway, there are my acknowledgments, and I apologize for forgetting them. In what I think is a logical order of for some importance, the first characteristic of this creature is that now I should have said this at the beginning, the witch is genderless. In Western thinking, in Western literature, a witch is female, but not in fact. Men and women both can be witches. Social subversion. The witch is the arch conspirator. The witch is the embodiment of negative emotions. The witch is filled with spite, envy, anger, negative emotions that turn people against each other. And the witch is seeking ways of undermining the social order. In the Christian context, and Christianity gave a whole new body of meaning to witchcraft beliefs. In the Christian context, the witch is motivated by, or indeed is an agent of Satan, whose reason for being is to undermine the Christian order. So this first attribute characterizes witchcraft beliefs as what I have said, the prototype, the granddaddy of conspiracy theories. Witches are most active at night. They can be active during the day, but they generally are not. They belong to a class of nocturnal creatures. Now, people everywhere fear the night. The night is to be feared by people in all cultures. In the nighttime, you stay inside. Outside are dangerous creatures. You don't venture out by yourself. If you do, you carry a light and you make some noise. It's better if you have a group of people with you, if you absolutely must be out. The fear of night is innate in people. I should have said also, attribute number one, the suspicion of others, of potential conspirators out there, is a universal fear, absolutely universal in human society. I'll come back to that later. The witch transforms itself. Rather than transformation, folklorists and others use the phrase shape-shifting. I don't know why. It seems like a clumsy phrase to me, but in any case, there it is, so I put it up. To change form. This is an attribute of the witch. It's also an attribute of the shaman. The shaman is a real person, a real human being with all of these attributes believed in him or her. As I've said already, the witch can change its form into something else or into nothingness. The witch can become invisible. Witches fly. A marker of witch beliefs is that they fly. They fly at tremendous speeds and tremendous distances. They can fly up into the clouds and bring storms. They can fly to their neighbor's house or to their neighbor's farm and work mischief. They fly to their targets. They fly into the bedrooms of children and steal them from their cribs at night. the parents find a corpse in the morning. They don't take the body, they take the soul, and they fly off to their gathering. Witches have a pet, an animal or a spirit which shares the witchcraft power and which can provide an alibi for the witch. The witch can stay home having tea with her neighbors, but her power is off in the form of her cat or her dog. Any domestic animal can be a familiar of the witch, carrying the power. The witch animal can fly and do all of the things that the witch can do. In early England and early America, the 17th century America, the common witch's familiar was a little spirit called an imp, I-M-P, so small it could fit into the witch's pocket. We'll talk about imps shortly. The individual witches of a community have limited powers, but they meet together. All of the witches of a community meet together at a particular time and particular place, at night, of course. And that meeting of the witches is the Sabbath. The word comes from the Hebrew word for their holy day, because the first group in the Middle Ages to be persecuted as witches were Jews. This is one of the many historical manifestations of anti-Semitism. Jews in the 14th and 15th centuries were accused of spreading the plague by poisoning wells. The blood libel was used widely at that time. Jews were accused of kidnapping Christian children and killing them and using their blood for the Passover matzah, that kind of horrible libel, which we still hear from time to time today. Some of the old tropes that characterize the history of anti-Semitism are alive and well in Europe today. Witches spread disease. This is a problem in the Congo right now. Ebola is poorly understood. It's a scourge, and one of the jobs that Doctors Without Borders or any modern or Partners in Health, any of these organizations of medical practitioners, one of the first jobs they have to do is to assure the people that this is not spread by witchcraft. This is spread by this microbe, and this is how you avoid catching it. 2 decades or 3 decades earlier, AIDS workers in Africa had to do the same thing. AIDS was spread by witches, and fears of spreading of AIDS led to some violent and bloody witch hunts in eastern and southern Africa. Witches steal children. The prototype of the image of the witch, the Halloween witch, the Hansel and Gretel witch, is that she steals children. This is part of the universal attributes of witches. And of course, this is a visceral fear among adults. Parents especially will become energized by any threat of danger to children, and any adults, not necessarily parents. Fear of danger to children motivates people. It's one of these fundamental fears that seems to me rooted in our evolutionary biology. Number 9, we are sexual beings. Sexuality is central to human culture. It is central to the fact of mammalian life, of animal life. We are sexual beings. The purpose of sexuality is to reproduce ourselves. It permeates our culture, but we are ambivalent about sexuality. And all cultures, I'm saying we human beings, this is a human issue. We are sexual beings, but we are reluctant to talk about it very much, And when we do, it's only certain categories of sexuality are public topics for discussion. Our ambivalence about our own sexuality is central to the psychology of this whole thing. This is one of the main things witches do. They interfere with human sexuality. Whatever is acceptable whatever is considered illicit sexual behavior at any given point in history or among any specific people, witches will do it. If homosexual relations are forbidden in a culture, witches will do it at their Sabbath. If pedophilia is prohibited, if bestiality is prohibited, or a variety of sexual positions are prohibited, witches will do it with each other. Incest is one of the first things witches do. Incest is a universal prohibition. In many cultures, it's a taboo. It's different from a crime, a sin, as I explained last week. Taboo is a regulation which, if violated, brings supernatural retribution rather than civil retribution. And in many cases, the commission of incest is unthinkable because the cosmic disruption that it can cause is potentially far more severe than any civil penalties. Witches engage in sex with their siblings, with their parents, with their children at the Sabbath. But witches also interfere with human sexuality throughout the world. In parts of Europe during the late Middle Ages and parts of Africa in the 20th century, men experienced the phenomenon that psychiatrists call penis flight, or other labels for it. Penis snatching. Men come to clinics complaining only to male doctors, not to a woman, and not to a nurse, not to a female, complaining that a witch or something is stealing the penis. The penis is shrinking and withdrawing into the body. It's disappearing. And this kind of a mass hysteria is noted throughout various parts of the late Middle Ages and in Africa during various of my periods of field work and in the newspapers. It was found was reported in Hong Kong in the 1960s and 70s, Shanghai, other parts of Eastern Asia. Epidemics of penis theft, and some men would clip their penis with a large clothespin to keep it from withdrawing into their bodies, being consumed figuratively by a witch. In the late Middle Ages, sexual intercourse was a sin. We performed it reluctantly in order to propagate ourselves, but not for pleasure. And if you got pleasure out of it, it was evidence that Satan was involved. And I'll show you some slides of the incubus and the succubus, male and female demons that would visit people at night, people of the other sex, and bring them to sexual climax, giving them an erotic dream. Clear evidence of the intrusion of a demon from hell, an ally of the medieval witch. And I could go on and on. Sexual dysfunction of any sort, and infertility among women and among men are commonly blamed on witchcraft around the world, because that's what witches do. They delight in interfering in the normal sexual relations of the living, of human beings. Now we get really serious. Witches are murderers. They steal their children. They also steal living adults and fly away with them to the Sabbath, where they have ritual murder, various forms of rituals. In the Christian context, it was a reversal of the Mass. Only Satan was the recipient of the sacrifice, and instead of the Eucharist, pieces of a newly slaughtered baby were used, and so on and so on. Ritual murder. The human victim, having been killed, was then dismembered. The body parts were dispensed on the black market. This was carried out by ghouls, Ghouls, where the word that comes from a Hindic language, I think. Ghouls were widely feared in late medieval Europe. They were grave robbers. They dug up corpses and cut them up and sold their body parts because people believed that there were certain powers in certain body parts. Witches do that, but mostly for their own consumption. Then they have a cannibalistic feast. Cannibalism is universally condemned. Now, that statement will be argued, and there are books written against that statement. Yes, indeed, there is ritual cannibalism, and yes, indeed, like in the case of a new king eating a bit of the previous king's heart or brain in order to gain courage, compassion, and wisdom, the symbolic ritual cannibalism. And there are the cases that are well known and shameful of people eating their deceased compadres, compatriots to avert starvation. People marooned, people in air crashes, and the Donner Party in the frontier days, and so on and so on. But as a cultural practice, the idea that people would hunt other people for food is an epithet used by many people against others. No, we are not cannibals, but those people are. And the accusation of cannibalism was widespread around the world, possibly universal, to indicate how primitive those people are, how uncivilized and savage those people are. They commit cannibalism. Cannibalism is the stuff of nightmares. It's abhorrent to most people in the world. Witches do it. Witches are cannibals. My first experience in one culture in West Africa that John mentioned to you, where I did my dissertation research among the Bachama, a small kingdom in the upper Benue Valley, I heard English-speaking Bachama talk about the cannibals, using the English word cannibal. Come on, there's no cannibalism. It's a myth. What are they really talking about? They were using the English word for this common attribute of witches. They were talking about the flying, transforming witches that kidnapped their victims and flew off with them to the Sabbath, where they had a cannibalistic orgy. Vampirism, blood drinking is part of it, but I separated them with separate numbers so they could be discussed separately. A belief in vampires is widespread, and frequently around the world, vampires are witches. Witches are vampires. The vampires of Bram Stoker's imagination are not witches, but they are like witches. They fly, they transform themselves, they have all this kind of power, and they are nourished by human blood. Again, a universal human nightmare. The idea that some other creature is attacking you and drinking your blood. Wasting diseases, particularly something like tuberculosis, was frequently blamed on vampiristic beings, human beings that flew in through your window while you were sleeping and sucked out your life force night after night after night, and so that you weakened and you became paler and paler. These beliefs spread through New England into the late 18th centuries, long after the witch fears, the witch crazes had died down. The last big witch hunts, as you all know, took place in Salem at the end of the 17th century. There were several others earlier in the 17th century, but they were gone by the 18th century. But vampire beliefs continued into through into the 19th century, the 1800s. I get 19 and 18 mixed up in my head. And that's an attribute of witches. And witches are always associated with death in some way. First, they are murderers. They kill people. They kill babies. They kill adults. They kill people in ritual forms, or they kill people out of revenge, out of anger. Many deaths are caused by witchcraft. One of the early studies of witchcraft by the second husband of Margaret Mead, Rio Fortune, the tall Australian whom she married, he was working on an island called Dobu in Melanesia while she was working over on Manus. And Fortune reported that on Dobu, all deaths are caused by witchcraft. There's no such thing as a natural death. The deaths of the aged and deaths of those by disease and deaths of the young, there's no concept of accident either. This is important. I mentioned this last week. Magical thinking is much more prevalent in cultures that don't believe in randomness or accident or chance. Everything has a cause, and usually that cause is discoverable. Witches kill. Witches meet in a place of death. The Sabbath is often held in a cemetery. If you go there, you're not likely to see anything because this is happening in a different dimension. Witches dig up corpses. They achieve nourishment from the dead. They dig up and eat parts of the dead to nourish themselves. Again, if you go to the cemetery in the morning, you won't see any fresh earth. This is done in a different dimension. Among the Navajo, witches steal corpses, they dig up graves, and they make a dangerous medicine which they fly with, and they drop it over the smoke holes of sleeping people at night, and they spread what is called ghost sickness from the ghost of the dead person who is hanging around near the body. Witches have some association with death in all parts of the world. And finally, witches often hang out at places of execution. That's another way that they are associated with death. If you have questions, shout them out right now, or I will move on to the next topic. Any questions about any of these attributes? I've given them to you on the form in a paper, so if you wanted to, you can take notes. There are far too many to memorize. Yes?
Well, it's interesting that the church very much looked on sexual behavior, even in a marriage, strictly for procreation.
Right.
But if you go in the Bible, it speaks about Adam and Eve becoming one, which clearly involves intimacy. It's speaking, and Paul basically forbids a married couple from abstaining from sex even during a fast. And so the scripture tends to look on, if you have a married couple, as intimacy being a natural part of it that should take place.
Okay, but so what?
So the Bible doesn't look on sexuality as always something bad or demonic.
I didn't mean to say that it did.
But what I mean,
In the late Middle Ages, this definitely was a Christian attitude in Western Europe. And let me just leave it there, okay? The Bible is a complex set of writings. And my God, look at the Song of Solomon, extolling the sexual beauty of women. I'm sorry, I shouldn't cut you off, but I think we're going to get distracted from my theme. There are some interesting questions. Witchcraft is one of those topics that academics have studied for many decades, not just historians interested in the history of European witchcraft and magic, but sociologists, because the sociology of witchcraft is fascinating. Who accuses whom? There seem to be patterns of suspicion and accusation. What's the difference between suspicion and accusation? The difference between thinking about something and actually speaking, and this involves getting into issues of libel and slander, and it becomes very complex. The witchcraft power is frequently believed to be carried in a family line. Everyone is born of a woman. The original witches in the mythology of witchcraft, the original witches were women, and they passed it on. And so if someone is a witch, then his or her family might be suspect, and the witch will be very eager to get rid of the witchcraft power through a ritual of exorcism, to take blame away from the family. It can get very complex. And another issue that I've already suggested, which is a question, is why is witchcraft found only in settled, complex societies, but not in nomadic, pastoral societies which are small, egalitarian, and moving frequently? This is another one of the puzzles that scholars of witchcraft worry about. And witchcraft beliefs in Africa are identical to witchcraft beliefs in early Europe, with the exception of the influence of Christianity, which really shaped European witchcraft beliefs with the introduction of the idea of Satan. But the attributes, these 14 attributes, are found in both European and African witchcraft. Africans were enslaved and brought, this is the infamous Middle Passage, where millions of enslaved Africans were brought into the Caribbean and the Southern American regions. But witchcraft doesn't exist there. Why not? It came directly from Africa, where it was rampant. The flying, transforming, child-stealing, death-dealing witch was alive and strong in Africa, but it did not take root in the new cultures created by the slave trade. There is definitely sorcery and a lot of mystical activities, and the beliefs that people can enlist the aid of spirits and do harm to other people by supernatural means, but not this witch. So it's a complex set of issues. I also want to make clear that I'm not talking about Wicca. That's why I put the word evil in my title. The classical witch is evil. The Wiccan is not evil. Wiccans believe indeed that if they do anything wrong, it will backfire. They are incapable of using their magic, M-A-G-I-C-K, for sorcery. And their god, their bigendered, bisexual god is benign, etc., etc. I am not talking about Wiccans. This is the Wiccan calendar, the wheel of the year with the major pagan festivals marked on it. This picture came from Erica Zhang's book on witches, way back in before Fear of Flying, I think 1980, or one of her early works. Witchcraft is the subject of jokes. This is a popular one. This is from the New York Times, but I saw a couple of these in Snyder over previous Halloweens. But I use this one because some of the classic images of the Western witch are in this dummy. The broomstick, which we'll talk about, the peaked, the conical peaked cap, the black cloak we will talk about. This is the witch we're talking about. You recognize this picture, I'm sure. This is the Wicked Witch of the East, played by Margaret. I was going to say Dorothy. That's Dorothy. Margaret Hamilton, who was really a terrific witch. With the black cloak and the conical, wide-brimmed witch's hat. All of that has meaning. It all has a derivation. The medieval witch was often a widow, an elderly widow. Her husband has died. Her children are gone. She's in constant mourning. She wears black, and she usually lives alone. She's not happy with her lot. She's not very pleasant. She's bitchy, and in cases where there is misfortune and witchcraft is suspected, she was like a likely suspect. Here's another version of the late medieval witch. Where did that conical peaked wide brim cap come from? Well, the wide brim I'm not sure about, but the origin of the conical cap is from heresy. The Inquisition in the 14th and later centuries were established to identify and get rid of heresy. Witchcraft is the arch heresy. It was Satan's activities on earth. Witches were the agents of Satan. Heretics were marked with, I'm sorry, I've got to be careful about this, with the conical cap, which we know as what? Dunce. The dunce cap was developed or labeled by a fellow who is glorified in Western New York, John Duns Scotus. There's a Duns Scotus Hall at, is it Canisius College or Canisius High School? Damon, right over here in Snyder. Damon, yes. Duns Scotus, John Duns Scotus, who was the namesake for the dunce cap, the mark of the heretic. This is St. Dominic presiding over an inquisitorial trial, an auto da fe, as it's sometimes called. These two are condemned and they're ready to be burned at the stake, and these guys with the conical caps are next. That seems to be the origin of the conical cap that witches used. The witch was the arch heretic. The word dunce cap is a Western English derivation of that. The first images of witches flying on broomsticks is quite late, about 1440. Where did this broomstick come? Witches everywhere. Wherever there are witch beliefs anywhere in the world, witches fly. Mostly they fly under their own speed. Sometimes they fly on some animal, but not. It's not the rule. Western witches started to fly on broomsticks in the middle of the 15th century. There's a speculation about this, which I'll get to in a minute. The Spanish painter Francisco Goya painted and drew a huge series of satirical scenes of reflecting back on the idiocy and the silliness of witchcraft beliefs a few centuries earlier. And here he has three witches with their conical peaked caps flying to the Sabbath, carrying a struggling human victim. They're flying pretty low. Passers-by, pedestrians on the ground are trying to hide so that the witches don't see them. This fellow is covering his body with a cloth, hoping that the witches will not notice him. This is just an image to show you another representation of the conical cap. The broomstick, again satirized by Goya. This one is called Linda Maestre, the beautiful mistress. An old hag who's approaching death is carrying a young girl off to the Sabbath to teach her the art of witchcraft. The idea of flight fascinated early French and other artists. Here are witches flying. I was going to get to that answering my question about the broomstick, but I think maybe it's coming next. I think I might have gotten a slide out of order. Levitation is involuntary. The witchcraft power it cannot always be controlled by its bearer. And of course, this offers an alibi and a basis for confession in some cultures too. If I was a witch, I didn't know it, I apologize, I want the power removed. And that was often acceptable. If there was a death or terrible property destruction involved, the person did not get off scot-free. There was some compensation required, but at least the witch would escape execution. The Witch's Kitchen, a Dutch artist, Frans Franken. The idea that witches could fly was fascinating to people in the late Middle Ages. The idea of flying is a universal human fantasy. What is the significance of it evolutionarily? I don't know. It's the subject of fairy tales. It's the subject of dreams. People admire the abilities of birds, the apparent freedom and glory of flight. It's a universal fantasy. So all witches in the late Middle Ages were able to fly. Now, this must have been a fantasy. Maybe these young women are simply imagining it. Alchemy was going along at the same time. And alchemists discovered various hallucinatory drugs, including atropine, which could be absorbed through the skin and gave the sensation of extra somatic activity, out-of-body experiences, an altered state of consciousness. Maybe that was it. And ointments made with an atropine base, belladonna, mandrake, those plants, came to be called witch's ointment. And here is a scene in a witch's kitchen, as it's called. It's now dusk, and the witches of the community have assembled to get ready for their nightly flights, undressing themselves. This one is being rubbed with the witch's ointment, and here you see one who's flying up the chimney. She's all been prepared. The idea of the witch's flight, the witch's ability to fly, was a strong subject of speculation and of art. Here's an old hag instructing a young woman. This is long before Hogwarts and the kind of instruction Harry Potter got. But the idea is there. I don't know if J.K. Rowlinson was influenced by these folklore about witchcraft, but she's uncomfortable on the broom, and the old hag is instructing her on how to use it. And so here's what I was thinking I had earlier. This is a bad reproduction of a painting called Departure for the Sabbath. The witch is astride her broomstick. Michael Harner, Harner, who still is, an anthropologist like me with similar interests, but Harner got interested in shamanism and was hooked on the idea of shamanism, the belief that the shaman really can transport his soul to another dimension. And he established his own kind of traveling roadshow of shamanism. He's the founder of urban shamanism. If you look him up online, you'll find him, Michael Harner. He wrote a book called Hallucinogens and Shamanism. Hallucinogens and Shamanism. This is taken from that book. I don't know if it was his theory, but he records this theory. Urban life in the Middle Ages was dismal for those who could afford it and miserable for the poor. It was a horrible existence. This supposition by Harner is that this flying ointment that the alchemists were producing could transport you, get you out of this horrible existence, at least for a few hours, and into a fantasy world. And the ointment had the capacity of entering the bloodstream through the skin. You simply rub it on. It would be much more effective and quicker if you rub it in through some membrane, right? Not external skin, but internal. So there are a few bodily orifices which lend themselves. The broomstick is the right shape. You coat the end of the stick with the ointment, insert it, lie back, and go off on your trip. So Harner has the explanation for flight and the broomstick in one. And he points to this painting to support. Now, this is based in fact. People did this. People applied the flying ointment to their bodies as it's a drug, and to escape from the current reality. The vampire bat. This is an American animal from the American Southwest. Vampire bats rarely attack people, but the idea of vampirism was already universal a long, long time before the habits of the southwestern vampire bat were explained. And of course, bats and any other nocturnal creatures, owls, creatures that are comfortable at night, were like cats, were frequent familiars of witches. Vampire bats live on blood, and Dracula had emerged. Actually, it was Varney. 50 or 60 years before Dracula, Varney the Vampire was a series in England long before Bram Stoker, living on human blood and flying at night and transforming himself and so on. The bat was called vampire because of the European creature, the vampire, the blood-sucking ghost, the same kind of revenant that attacked people in New England in the early 19th century. Oliver Reed as a werewolf. Vampiristic people, the myth of vampires, New Orleans vampires and others, Stoker's original, and stories of werewolves are all in the same vein. The idea that people can transform themselves into animals is a universal belief, absolutely universal, sometimes associated with witchcraft, and many times in cultures that don't have witches, they still have these beliefs in people. And many of those transformed human animals, W-E-R, an old word for man, many of them are vampires. And many of the dangerous creatures of the night, mostly mythical, attack people and suck their blood, one of the fundamental fears. Domestic animals flying off at the Sabbath. Any farm animal, any household animal could be a familiar for the witch that lives in the house. And these are obviously people in half transformed, flying off to join their human masters and mistresses at the Sabbath. Matthew Hopkins, look him up. Fascinating. I don't know his psychology. He power hungry, deluded, whatever. He declared himself Witchfinder General. That title was his own. It was not conferred on him by anybody, certainly not by Parliament, in the 18th century. See if there's, 17th century, sorry. And here's Matthew Hopkins having revealed certain of the familiars of English witches. He went from town to town. He was a witch hunter. Here is a witch who has confessed, and she is naming her witches, Ile Malzar, Pyewacket. Look up that name, Pyewacket, P-Y-E, Wacket, was used in a movie, a stage play. Kim Novak played a witch called Pyewacket. I think this name came into the Hollywood folklore. And these other names I won't even try to pronounce or speak, but these are common names of English familiars. And Holt, this is a person, a spirit that reveals himself as a person, simply called Holt. People tried to find who is this Holt. It's just one of the familiars of English imagination. These are imps. Witches were tested by the swimming test. You probably heard of it. There are different theories. Witches fly, so therefore they must be lighter than other people, right? So if you throw a suspected witch into the pond, you bind her hands and feet together. If she floats, she's probably guilty because. And another explanation was the water tries to reject her because she is pure evil, and the water is sacred, you know. And if she sinks, she's innocent. And the family of the suspected person would dive in and pull her out if she was obviously not rising to the surface on her own. Another of Goya's satirical paintings, a young man has come home late from the farm or from wherever he is caught in darkness. And notice the moon, the crescent moon. Remember I talked about the horns of the moon last week? It's not the full moon that is the bewitching moon, but the crescent moon, the moon with horns. And he is on his knee begging. He's caught these witches on their way to the Sabbath, carrying a basket of babies, accompanied by their various familiars. This one has been flying and comes down to see what the commotion is. This one is sticking a pin in a doll, the classic voodoo magic. This is part of Goya's imagination. It's just one of his satirical paintings illustrating some of the beliefs of medieval witchcraft. And this is by Pierre de l'Ancre, a witch hunter from Orléans in France, who himself was responsible for several hundred executions. I don't know how many. This is the witch's Sabbath. This is a classic illustration of the Sabbath. In the center is the cauldron, and all kinds of horrible things are put into the cauldron and mixed together to make the terrible poison that witches take to spread their horrible diseases. And at various levels, you see different activities of witches dancing with each other, dancing naked, dancing with demons, flying on a goat. Before the broomstick, witches frequently flew on rams or goats, male rams or male goats. The goat is often a metaphor for or a symbol of Satan. The male, uncastrated male goat is an awful creature, a very likely familiar of the witch. He was a familiar of Esmeralda, the dancing girl, remember, in Hugo's The Bell Ringer of, what was it called? The Hunchback of Notre Dame. She was suspected of being a witch, a gypsy girl by herself dancing with a goat. My God, of course she's a witch. And here up in this scene, a human woman like Rosemary in that classic film, right? And her demon lover are presenting to Satan the child that they have conceived. Satan is seated in the form of a goat with his two lieutenants on either side of him. These illustrate beliefs in a very Dante-esque fashion of beliefs of what a Sabbath was like. The devil, the master himself, carries off a child, the parents of the child begging to let him go. And witches cooking babies, roasting here or boiling. Witches, civilized witches didn't always eat their children raw. They cooked them. And the terrible libel of the Jews. These are from Joshua Trachtenberg's book, The Devil and the Jews, first published in the 1940s, and showing the essence of this libel. The Jews first circumcise and then kill a Christian child. And the Jewish sow, the Jewish female pig. This is another terrible image. This, of course, is Satan. The Jews were in league with Satan in the Christian folklore. Other scenes of medieval witch beliefs, Satan appears in the form of a goat or a goat-like. He is a fallen angel according to the book of Enoch, and often has wings. But in the book of Revelation, chapter 20, he is condemned to under the earth, where he develops reptilian characteristics. Here he is blessing new witches who trample on the cross as their final oath to him, and then they kiss him under the tail, the obscene kiss. This is another European invention of what witches, agents of Satan, are bound to do. And here are ghouls cutting down corpses from the execution hill, cutting them up on a table and stowing the body parts in bags to carry away and sell for magical purposes. Cats prowling around your house. In the springtime, when the cats are out at night, when they're yowling, we know what they're doing. In the Middle Ages, or actually much more recently, that was a sure sign that witches were out. Other scenes we've already seen. Here's a witch stirring up a storm. Another painting by Goya, an old hag offering a skeletal child to the god of the witches. Satan was a great deceiver, and he dressed as a dapper young man and seduced unwitting peasant girls and made witches out of them. And this girl is just taken by this dashing fellow. She doesn't know any better, and she doesn't see his claw feet or his tail coming out from under his coat. And the incubus, the male demon that attacks a woman sleeping alone at night and brings her to sexual climax. The nightmare, the classic painting by Henry Fuseli. And the word nightmare was misunderstood. It comes from an old word for spirit, mara, but it was interpreted as a female horse. And many of these scenes of the nightmare show the demon from hell sitting on the helpless woman. She's in a state of sleep paralysis or whatever. She's asleep but unable to move. The demon is sitting on her. And there's the horse that he rode in on. That has nothing whatsoever to do with the activities of the incubus. Here's another of the same kind of scene. And another incubus who is about to have sex with this sleeping woman who who is awake but unable to move and resist, and the succubus, from the Latin, French, to lie over. The woman who brings the sleeping male to sexual climax. And sexual orgies are common at the Sabbath. Here are witches lining up to kiss Satan under the tail, and he presides over an orgy of human women and human people and demons of both sexes. Reminiscent of Dante's Inferno, here are the levels of hell. Satan, the arch cannibal, at the bottom, his mouth full of human body parts. Satan carries these attributes to his human servants, who are witches. This is a picture from San Gimignano, I think, in Italy, one of the frescoes showing Satan the cannibal, one of the levels of hell. Cannibalism, as I said, is absolutely horrible to imagine. Jews being burned as witches, among the first people to be rounded up as a group. And the Cheltenham witches of England in the 17th century. This is a famous scene. These women have been hanged. These women are next. This fellow is testing to see if there's any pulse left. Witches were hanged in England and the colonies, not burned. A famous quiz show question: how many witches in Salem were burned? Right? Of course, none is the answer. The evil eye, which is located around the Mediterranean areas, concentrating in what is now the Middle East, is today even a form of witchcraft beliefs. It is a power vested in certain people that is activated by the emotions. Certain people who have it may not even know that they have it. It operates through the direct gaze. And universally, direct gaze is rude among strangers anyway. And in the Mediterranean area, direct gaze is dangerous. And people who have been gazed upon will cross themselves or will seek some kind of supernatural cure. This is an anti-evil eye plaque that is posted on the outside of the doorway of a Jewish house in Old Palestine. These indentations were filled with pieces of mica which reflect. The gaze could be reflected back at the gazer or perhaps off in another direction so that it did not infect people in the house. When I was reading to you a list of superstitions last week, I talked about the cornuto, the little gold horn that Italian Americans used to wear. Some still do, on a gold necklace, right? Here are some examples of it. These are horns, stylized horns, which have power universally, and they are anti-evil eye charms. The manu fica, the clenched fist with the thumb between the two first fingers, the manu fica, the fig hand, represents the female genitals, represents power. It is a protective form of magic against the evil eye. Satanism, I'm going to finish in a couple of minutes here. You've been very patient, and we'll have some questions. The satanic cult scares, which began in about exactly in 1980 and ended roughly 15 years later in the middle 1990s. Dr. Jeffrey Victor of the Department of Sociology at Jamestown Community College wrote a book called Satanic Panic, which has gone into several printings. So it's a very popular book. This is from that book, and it shows the location of satanic rumor panics in America with the dates of the newspaper reports about them. This is one that affected Jamestown and areas of northern Pennsylvania. On May 13th, 1988, a blonde, blue-eyed virgin was going to be kidnapped in the village of Jamestown and was going to be taken by a satanic cult and used in a human sacrifice. This was the rumor on Friday, and it was a Friday. May 13th, 1988 was a Friday. Kids were kept home from school. Police leaves were canceled. There were runs on gun stores, and I'm not exaggerating. A full-fledged satanic rumor panic was underway. Satanists, which again are imaginary, were able to do almost all the things that classical witches do. Very rarely were Satanists alleged to be able to fly or to transform themselves. But all the rest of the things they did, ritual murder, cannibalism, vampirism, and the subversion of Catholicism, subversion of Christianity, were part of the satanic corpus. And I was looking for explanations. Satanism spread. I think it began in the US, but it spread to England, throughout Europe, into Australia. And there were allegations of Satanism and satanic ritual activity, SRA, which was became, in some quarters, an acceptable psychological syndrome. It was a diagnosis, SRA. Not now. 30 years ago, you are disturbed today because in your childhood your parents subjected you to SRA. And this was a widespread myth that spread around the world. And it resulted in several sensational trials, very expensive trials, with very real defendants. The biggest and longest and most expensive was the Manhattan Beach trial in Manhattan Beach, California, which went on for 7 years and cost $7 million or many millions of dollars. And they ruined lives. They ruined reputations. Talk about witch hunts. This was a modern version of the witch hunt. And people were saying, there's got to be something to it. Why would people here and people way over there, thousands of miles away, why would they be telling the same stories? We can't say that they heard it from us. These stories didn't spread. They came up in unrelated parts of the world, people telling the same stories. By this time, I had my attributes of witches, and I saw that many of those allegations of satanic activity were the same. And I had already concluded that these are gut, visceral fears that people have. They are the stuff of nightmares. Something triggers them, and it's very much like a kind of a collective contagious hysteria which hits people from time to time. The case of the noises in Leroy, the Leroy fits, these kids at the high school in Leroy who were subject to all kinds of jerks and involuntary sounds, and that spread and became contagious. There was one similar case at Star Point High School up here in Niagara County, where people smelled terrible odors, which closed down classrooms and sent kids home, but no odors were ever identified or measured. These were kinds of collective hysterias, and the Satanism scares were similar, and they generate these visceral expressions of fear, the very substance of nightmares in people. Cannibalism, vampirism, the blood sacrifice, bloody murder, the Halloween series of movies, the Texas Chainsaw stuff. This is the subject of horror movies, and to me, the elements in the Satanism scares confirmed my theories of witchcraft beliefs. Here's where I'm going to end, I think. 2 pages from a little cartoon booklet that was found in Jamestown, published by Chick, like a chicken publications, in Chino, California. A little booklet called The Poor Little Witch. And I obtained their permission to use these pages from their booklet. This tells a typical story of a young girl, a child of a single, hardworking mother. The girl, there's no father, there's no siblings. The girl is not very attractive, not very popular. She's a likely subject for enticement into a satanic cult. Her teacher is a member of the cult. Her teacher notices her vulnerability and invites her to come and join the group. Mandy, as is her name, she's honored, flattered by the attention that she's getting, and she comes and joins the group until she realizes what's going on in this. Here's the high priest. Everybody's in black robes. The cross is upside down, a black-robed figure playing an organ. And the high priest is saying, "Welcome, beloved brothers and sisters. Tonight is a night of great celebration and sacrifice to our most holy Father," capitalized, right? And of course, that's Satan, "in order that he might pour out his blessings upon us. Sister Lorraine has especially conceived this child for us tonight." When the satanic cult fears were spreading across the country and they were sacrificing children, people inevitably asked, where are these children coming from? You know, the number of alleged satanic killings far exceeded the numbers of missing children. And so the FBI got into the act, and a fellow named Richard Lanning wrote papers on this and trying to expose the fallacy behind it. But one explanation was that the satanic cult was kidnapping young women, taking them off the streets. These are young women whose absence wouldn't be missed, impregnating them and keeping them in cabins in the woods through their gestation until they're ready to deliver 9 months later to produce children for the cult. This was the explanation for why the cult could find children to kill, which when there were no children missing, reported missing. Our most holy Father, accept this sacrifice, and the priest stabs the child in a bloody fashion. And Mandy can't believe it, and the members are chanting, "Hail Satan." And here's a footnote. This is supposed to give you some credibility, right? Police estimate between 40,000 to 60,000 ritual homicides per year occur in the U.S., credited to a Dr. A. Carlisle in a homicide investigation seminar that was held in Las Vegas, Nevada in 1986. Now, I have no doubt that someone named Dr. Carlisle made those statements in such a conference, because I participated in similar conferences to talk about satanic murder and so on. I was trying to talk about the myth, the folklore behind it. There was no category of ritual murder. There is a maximum of about 20 to 23,000 murders per year in the U.S. This claim of 40,000 to 60,000 ritual homicides was not examined. You know, it just was part of the fantastic folklore. Mandy's teacher takes some of the child's blood in a goblet and gives it to Mandy to drink, and she says, "No, I'm not feeling very well." She escapes from the cult, and she makes her way to a fundamentalist Christian church front, in a church, in a storefront in town. And the minister conducts an exorcism, drives the demons out of Mandy. Here they are flying out of the window. And he says, "Mandy, now you are cleansed by the blood of Jesus," etc., etc. But the cultists won't let you get away. You've got to spend the night here. It's the full moon, Mandy. Stay with us tonight. Mandy says, no, I'm okay. And Mandy, on her way home, sure enough, she is captured by the Satanists, and they take her away. They kill her. The final scenes in in the booklet show Mandy and the pastor of her church, who was a member of the cult. Both had died that night, and they're arriving in heaven. And God is saying to Mandy, you are welcome here. But he points to the pastor and says, nope, you're going to the other place. Satanism is an expression of the same attributes that the medieval witch showed. And the medieval witch, the African witch, the Melanesian witch, the flying, transforming, child-stealing witch is a composite of a living human nightmare. The elements in that composite are themselves universal fears and fantasies.
Okay, Dr. Stevens. If anybody has a question, you can come up to the microphone.
I'm just wondering the significance of the naked witches and the broomsticks. Because
Thank you. That's part of the whole sexuality thing. In parts of Africa, witches perform naked. And they do a lot of horrible things. They fly upside down. They are able to fly because they have kind of a jet propulsion coming out of their anus. Or the females out of all of the orifices. And there are images of witches flying naked with little streams of fire coming behind them.
Oh.
Nakedness is part of it. It's against the norms of the culture.
Okay. And then when did now they're fully robed with the big hats and the long black robes. They're fully clothed with the boots and everything. When did that change over?
When they go to the Sabbath, they take it all off.
Okay. Okay. I have another question, too. Back then, the witches, when people thought these women were witches, could they have been psychics maybe back then? And, it's interesting because I just had a past life reading, if people believe in that. And back then they said I was possibly a witch because I was known as the woman who knew too much. So maybe there's some kind of psychic connotations with witches, possibly?
I was interviewed several decades ago in the radio and by the Buffalo News by a fairly prominent reporter for the news. And I was describing this psychic aspect of witches, that they could be invisible and they could project their souls out of their bodies and so on, and fly at tremendous speeds. And he was saying, so it's like those women down at Lilydale. And I said, no. The spiritualists at Lilydale are not witches. He wrote this into his column. He came to that conclusion himself. And I've had students who have had some training in or interest in various PSI, energy beliefs, And this aspect of the witch appealed to them too. And maybe this is a foundation for that belief. And so I'm just throwing this back at you to say, yes, that may be. Maybe there is, because this idea too is fairly universal, if not absolutely universal. The shaman is found in cultures that don't have witches. But the shaman does so many of the same things that witches are believed to be able to do. He flies, he or she, women can be shamans, and he projects his soul out of his body, and he does miraculous healings, not poisonings.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. But I want to make a sharp distinction. In the world of mystical beliefs, it can get very complex, and some of these belief systems can overlap.
Is there a universal or easy way or to kill witches, or a difficult way to kill witches?
Easy way to kill witches?
Kill witches. Yeah, they were hanging them in Salem, and that seemed to do the trick.
And in Europe, you burned them And after the burning, you pulverize the body, because these are all Christians who believed in the resurrection, after the final judgment. The idea that witches could be resurrected was anathema, and so the body of the witch was pulverized and scattered. In Africa, in my experience, I don't want to generalize. I spent some time in Nigeria, and there are similar beliefs in neighboring cultures in West Africa. So I'll just talk about West Africa. There are special categories of people who are able to kill witches. They are able to drive out spirits. Wherever there are witch beliefs, there have to be anti-witchcraft methods. There have to be. This is among them. And some priests have a special kind of spear, which I saw and took pictures of. It's very flimsy. If you threw it, it would wobble like this in flight, and it would not be accurate. But it kills witches, and it kills spirits. So this is a legitimate question that a number of cultures have devised answers for.
You mentioned the crescent moon, and I was wondering, where's the origin of the crescent moon in Islam? Probably there's a good reason for it among Muslims, but once they adopted the crescent moon, I would imagine some Christians would have looked on it as a demonic symbol.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Christians have a knack of finding demonic symbols in other people's religious expressions. Did you come to my talk last week? I talked about the power in horns and the horned phases of various planets and so on. Galileo wrote a treatise on the horns of Venus. That was the title of his treatise. Horns are powerful, and the crescent phase of the moon was a powerful phase. Things would happen. But in the crescent in Islam is different. Anyone answer the question about where that comes from? Where does the crescent come from as a symbol of Islam? The Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar. And the new moon is a mark of the new cycle. The new moon is we've come around again, and it's a new cycle. And the sighting of the new moon is an important event for the, what's he called? The one who calls the prayers from the the Mizan, whatever it is. That's where it comes from. It's a symbol of the cycle of time and ritual. Any other questions for now? Rick.
Yes, last week you spoke of the universality of magical thinking, and obviously today's talk was about the universality of witchcraft.
Mind you, the attributes of the witch are universal. The witch itself is not.
All right, then the attributes. So going back to early man, we think about the formation of tribal units of society. It seems that this sort of was a development that came out of the fear of the other. We talk about, for example, today we use the term demonizing. We demonize the other because they're different. They're like the social outcasts. They don't fit into our own way of thinking. So could you speak to that?
That's my attribute number one, the social subversion attribute of the witch. And I thank you for that, because I didn't emphasize that in my talk. Every group of people everywhere throughout history has had a incipient potential belief in conspirators out there, the other that Rick is talking about. This place runs on its volunteers. Do you know Rick Zotaro is one of the more active of the CFI's volunteers? And in times of stress, when a scapegoat is needed, that's when conspiracy theories develop and become more elaborate. The idea of the other out there that is jealous of or angry at us and wants to somehow do us harm and maybe even has supernatural power at its disposal. That idea is absolutely universal, and it becomes important in times of social stress of various sorts. And I suggest it's rooted in the fact of being human, because there's a clear social function here. Fear of dangerous others keeps us together. Alone, we are flimsy, fragile, but together we can make things happen. We can do things.
So my second half of the question is, because of that, the other being ostracized, would the development of their sense of having powers come out of a sense of capitalizing on that? Like, in other words, if they're being cast aside, they're going to use that in a way to boost their own importance in that society? I don't know if I'm making myself
Maybe.
clear. Okay. I know it's conjecture.
Can you elaborate a little bit? I'm
Well,
not fully getting it.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that if a person or a segment of society is feeling like they don't belong to that society, could they have developed these rituals and thought processes that they have this supernatural power as a way of making themselves self-important in that society?
I guess I did hear you right. I don't know. I can't try it. I can't attempt an answer.
All right. Well, thank you.
We can
Anyway.
talk afterward, and I'll try to get a better idea of. Sorry,
It's okay.
I can't.
Room for
do it.
conversation later.
Okay. Anybody else?
Could you do a little more of an explanation of what an imp is? Or how the imp...
An imp, IMP, is a demonic spirit usually given to the witch by Satan, very small. And so one of the popular meanings of the word imp is smallness, right? And parents would call their kids, you little imp, in a joking way. The kids could slither under furniture and get away from the wrath of their parents. It attaches itself to the witch. In fact, in New England, maybe Old England too, I'm not certain about this, not only does it attaches itself physically to the witch. And one of the methods of the witch finder was to strip a woman and look for the witch's teat or a mark that might be where the imp had suckled at her, not necessarily the breast, some extra place on the body, a mole or something. So the imp might, very much like a leech, might attach itself physically to its master, mistress, and get power and nourishment at the same time. But otherwise, it was a typical familiar. It would take the witch's power and fly off and do terrible things while the witch stayed at home. In Africa, witches' familiars are other kinds of nocturnal creatures. The idea of the familiar, I think, is probably found wherever there are witches. In England and New England, it was very commonly a spirit. But in other parts of the world, it was more commonly an animal. A fox in Japan, owls and bats. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I was just going to bring this up because, well, this happened back in the ancient 1940s. My mother was telling a story about how a friend of hers from school, they, I guess, were walking to this other woman's house, and they had to cross the street and go through this little ritual to protect themselves from this woman who had the evil eye.
Are you of Italian ancestry?
No, this other woman was. I'm Polish
Okay.
ancestry. But
Okay.
my mother was absolutely fascinated by this whole thing, and I can't reproduce the ritual. I'll be seeing her in a couple of days. I'll have to ask her again exactly the whole thing that she had to go through to protect themselves from the evil eye.
I don't know about rituals of protection, but there are lots of body actions and signs and things with the hand. You can make the sign of horns to protect yourself. The horns are the sign of power is power itself. The fika, the fig hand, is another. And of course, the cornuto. Are there any people of Italian ancestry here who do you have this in your background? You have one on now? Your grandmother did, though, right? But then there are rituals of divination to determine who might be doing it and find that person. And again, very much like witches, European witches anyway, if I did it, I wasn't aware. I didn't know that I was doing it. And then the job is to find a witch doctor who exorcises the power. And the power of the evil eye, the malocchio, can be exorcised from the one who has it. Go ahead.
Hi, I don't have a question. I just have a little bit of a discussion with my mom here. So we were talking and we said that this kind of concept of the witch, the female witch, does not really exist in the culture where I come from. Someone mentioned like Islamic societies and Middle Eastern countries. We do have the concept of the jinn, the demon that is mentioned in the Quran, for example. We do have somewhat like magicians.
Where is your country, may I ask?
Pakistan.
I'm sure there were witches in your history.
But it's actually usually a male figure who does all of those attributes that you had. You know, sitting in the graveyard, dismembering bodies and like casting spells on people. But it's usually a male, and that could be a bit of a witch.
And they do some of these terrible things,
Yes,
right?
yes. Yeah. Again, at night, people, they're scared of going to the graveyards or somewhere like that because things like this could be happening.
Yep.
So I just wanted to add to the discussion.
Well, thank you for that. This is just one of those pieces that are all lumped together in the character of the witch.
Yeah.
But these pieces are spread out throughout the cultures of the world.
Yeah.
Hunters and gatherers had the same kind of fears of creatures of the night. Some of them were cannibalistic, and some of them were used socially as a boogeyman to discipline their kids. Don't go out at night. Don't go into that neighborhood.
Yeah. Also, for the evil eye, we have a very strong concept of the evil eye.
Oh, good. Okay, I thought you would.
How you would, ward it off. People have things like, for a baby, if you put a black mark on their cheek or near their eye or somewhere, just to make them look uglier a little bit.
Yes.
To dispel that kind of, people might look at them and say, oh, they're adorable. But, if you have that black mark somewhere, that would somehow deflect.
Thank you for that. That's found throughout the Middle East. And you want to be careful about complimenting a mother on her beautiful baby.
Yeah.
The baby is beautiful. We love babies. The cute factor, as evolutionists call it, right? Oh, but it's fussy. Oh, but it's colicky. Oh, its nose is running. Does it have a cold? You want to temper your praise so that they don't think, if the baby gets sick that night, the mother will remember that you praised that baby while staring at it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then we have tying of black threads. Sometimes take a black thread and tie it on the wrist or somewhere on the body of the child or, a bride maybe, just to kind of deflect those kind of like.
A very common amulet is the khamsa.
Yes.
Do you know Arabic? The hand.
The hand.
And in Arabic, it's the hand of Fatima.
Yeah.
And it's a symmetrical hand. The thumb and the fingers are the same. Yeah. And in the center of it is a blue stone.
Yes.
A blue crystal.
Turquoise. Yeah.
A shiny blue stone. Yeah. Blue is a pacifying, calming color, and it reflects back. And
in Turkey, we
have called in Hebrew? The same idea in Hebrew.
Yeah. in Turkish they have the blue stone with the that's the hamsa. Yeah.
You have one.
With the
Yeah,
dot in the
good,
middle.
that's it. There it
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
So it looks like an eye. So it's like an eye reflecting the evil eye coming at a person. So you could have that on buildings. You could have that as a necklace, as a pendant. That's
And
pretty
then
common.
this is the stylized eye of Fatima, the sister of Muhammad,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It's called the nazar in
Peace
Turkish.
be upon him. Sorry.
Yeah. So
Thank
those
you
are
for
a
that.
few
Are there
ways
any
of-
other comments or questions? You're a great audience, and I'm sorry to end this. We can carry on. I'll be glad to stay. I'm not going to go out to the bar with some of you, but I'll be glad to stay here and chat with any of who would like to. Okay. Then.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that bell to be notified about new videos. You can follow us on social media, and if you really love what we do, consider supporting us with a donation. Links to all that good stuff is in the description below.